All narratives about the past are actually about experiencing the moment. So why is he telling me the story of Moses? If you ask me who would best understand Moses, it would be a murderer serving time in prison for killing someone. In a sense, this is a secular or cultural interpretation of the holy book. In other words, what you call a holy book actually gains its sanctity by interpreting an unholy world. That is, the holy book derives its holiness by sanctifying something that is not holy. It draws its power from there. Unfortunately, the point the world has reached right now is exactly 180 degrees away from the society that the Quran describes as paradise. So is this possible? In fact, religion itself is possibility, prayer is possibility. Possibility is what connects us to life in the first place.
Istanbul. Greetings to everyone from the school, dear viewers. Today we will talk about the Quran's dual reference system. Our guest is Professor Dr. Şaban Ali Düzgün. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
How are you?
Thank you. And you?
Thank you very much.
May God grant you goodness.
Thank you, Professor. We would like to continue talking about the Quran. Do you think it is possible to have a system of understanding the Quran that can grasp the past, the future, and the present when interpreting and understanding it?
Wonderful. In fact, you started with an emphasis on time. So we have a book in our hands from which we expect to provide a perspective on the past, the present, and the future. Now, in our interaction with books or with a divine message, sometimes we might fall into the trap of overloading it or having excessive expectations. I mean, what kind of book is this? After all, it is a book, but before that it is an address. And by its very nature, an address aims to offer solutions to the people of the moment it speaks to. If there is a problem or a blockage, it seeks to resolve it. Is this what is expected? In other words, at the very least, we can talk about an address that prioritizes the problems of the time it was delivered, or, if we're talking about a holy book, the issues of the time of its revelation, and then about the process of that address becoming a book. But what is our expectation? Since we say that a sacred book is addressed by a being who possesses indisputable, unquestionable knowledge of the past, present, and future, knowledge of what has happened, what is happening, and what will happen, through this sacred book, it is expected that such a being would produce a conceptual map that takes into account all the categories of the human being addressed, their ways of thinking, their emotional categories, and all such aspects concerning their past, present, and future. Therefore, our expectation is not actually excessive. Our expectation is not too much. Since in the context of a sacred book, we will correct our use of the term author to mean the divine, but even when I read any author with high expectations, I want them to meet those expectations. Therefore, when I open and look at a divine book, I expect to find my sorrow about the past. This is what the Quran says. For example, believers do not have sorrows about the past. There is a cleansing of the past, and when it comes to human life, what we call the past is actually our memories and our recollections. This memory, these recollections, may be formed from traumas or from victories, personally, socially, as a nation, or as a civilization. Isn't that right? In the end, life is full of ups and downs. We call this a rhythmic life. Civilizations and societies, just like the rhythm of the day or the seasons, adapt to this rhythmic way of living. This is a social theory. Just as dawn breaks after twilight, or just as we see the signs before sunset, all people experience this rhythmically. In other words, there is darkness and there is also light.
Professor, when we think of it like a heartbeat, if those ups and downs didn't exist, if it was just a straight line, it would mean that life has ended.
There is a rhythmic order. This rhythmic order exists in nature as well. This rhythmic order exists in history too. And this rhythmic order exists in my personal life as well. So first of all, it teaches us this. In other words, there are ups and downs Therefore, when we look at the past, at memory and recollection, the Quran says not to carry the events that hurt or wounded us into today, not to make them a burden or baggage for the present. And it says they do not bear the sorrow of the past, and closes that chapter. From the perspective of the philosophy of history, God's manifestation as a power, a wise force that accompanies history, is a suggestion of wisdom to the audience he addresses. Do not bring the burden of the past into today and block it. Do not obstruct the present. Now, what about the future? The future exists for me only as a realm of possibilities. The Quran presents the future as a field of hope. I don't say expectation. Hope is broader than expectation. It is a more far-reaching concept. It offers a promise of hope. Therefore, there is something I always say about the Quran. The Quran is not a data repository for us. So if I can't find it, I'll go there and open it and see if I can find it. It's not that kind of data repository. The main reason for a person's connection to the Quran and to the divine who revealed the Quran is its promises. Because I too can promise you many things, but I might fall short of my promises. I might not be able to fulfill them. However, if God makes a promise, he never breaks it. A human can break a promise, can show weakness. God never breaks his promise. Secondly, he also has the power to fulfill his promises. Therefore, what opens the door to religion, what brings a person to the threshold of faith above all else, are the promises. So what is the future then? For us, the future is a hope, and there is no anxiety there. La raybi fi, there will never be anxiety and doubt. So in this way, through the Quran, we resolve both states, both of our wings.
We have talked about the past and the future. For our sorrows in the past, there is a remedy, a definition. And for the future, it promises us certain things. There is a promise of a future, perhaps the afterlife, perhaps paradise, or even better things.
There is a promise of a better society. So let's put it this way, Ms. Fatma. The Quran's discussions about paradise should be taken as a kind of simulation. In other words, when it talks about paradise, it is actually a demand to establish something similar to that paradise here. So rather than focusing on the phenomenon itself, it assigns value to it. Therefore, paradise is an eternal abode that we will go to in the afterlife after we die. However, building something similar to it here is our human duty in this world. To put it simply, it says that in paradise, feelings of malice, hatred, and envy have been removed from people's hearts toward one another. Now, raise the society you live in to such a standard that people do not envy one another, do not try to trip each other up. And I'm not just talking about Turkish society here. Unfortunately, the point the world has reached right now is exactly 180 degrees opposite to the kind of society the Quran describes as paradise. So, is this possible? In fact, religion itself is possibility. Prayer is possibility. Possibility is what connects us to life. It could also be otherwise. It is the possibility that moves us to action. Otherwise, if you absolutize the present moment, if you are locked into the present, it means you have lost all hope. So think of it this way. For example, when Joseph was thrown into the well, the moment does not become absolute there. It doesn't freeze. Because he gets out of there, it evolves into something else. Let's say the prophet experienced a blockage in the cave of Thor. He experienced a constriction. It became the subject of verses. But that moment does not become absolute. It doesn't freeze there because he gets out of there. Therefore,
Great definition, making the moment absolute.
we should not make the moment absolute. So what the Quran gives to its addressee is life. It flows dynamically. What you need to do is accompany this life, this flow. Just don't block it. In other words, the word sabaha, or what we call tasbih in the Quran, is exactly flow. It's pure flow. You'll see this when you read the philosophy of Muhammad Iqbal. He even says that the smallest atomic particles that make up the universe have a self because they serve the flow. A role has been assigned to them in the flow. They do not block the flow. So it has lifted the sorrow of the past, given hope for the future, and motivated us regarding what needs to be done. But I say that the past is now just a memory, a recollection. There's no way to go back, no way to bring it back. Temporally speaking, the future doesn't exist yet. It's only a plan and desires. Those are what guide us. There are anxieties, they lead us to take precautions and so on. So in reality, we have only one unit in our hands, and that is the present moment. We have real time between what no longer exists and what has not yet come. Ahmet Ziauddin Gümüşhanevi calls this the eternal now. The eternal now. In other words, the real time that gathers up the past and the future within itself. So, as an active individual in the present, as the subject of history, we can only act as beings capable of doing something. In other words, God does not descend to earth to feed a hungry person right here. That would be against his law. Otherwise, I would not exist. So in the language of the Quran, the speaker's entire desire is to somehow penetrate the being to whom he is addressing, first into their world of thought. In other words, what is right, what is wrong. A sense of certainty. He will plant doubts throughout your mind. With this sense of certainty that will remove doubt. A person who reaches a definite conviction about something takes action. First, certainty. There must be no doubt. After that, in order for you to take action, this time he begins to appeal to your emotional world. In fact, this is pedagogy. That is, first we give the student the right answer. For example, supporting people who are poor or in need brings about social peace. It saves those people from misery. Are we all in agreement on this, friends? Yes, we are. This is definite knowledge. After that, we move into the world of emotions. We say that this increases our sense of brotherhood. It creates a bond of the heart between us and them. By appealing to this emotion, I establish such an emotional connection that the student says, then let's go, teacher. Let's find a few people in need and support them. In order for you to take action, you need to go through this process, the process of certainty, the mental process, the emotional world, that is the heart process, and then the action process. There is no alternative to this. In other words, to move someone to action, you have to follow this process. That's why in the Quran, whatever doubts the audience has, whether about society or the afterlife, are addressed first. First, it structures the mind regarding all categories you can think of. Then it descends into the emotional world, and after that, it transforms life through actions. This is what we refer to as the dual system, which we highlighted in our title. What we mean by the dual system is this. The terms used in the Quran are generally unseen terms, metaphysical terms. Let's give an example. The hereafter. What is it that you call the hereafter? If you were to ask any ordinary person, what is the hereafter? They would say, it is the life after death. This is correct, but it is an incomplete definition. We say that for a word that has metaphysics at one end, there is physics at the other. For a word that has God at one end, there is the human being at the other. For a word that has the hereafter at one end, the world is at the other. So what concerns us is the hereafter. All right, the hereafter is the life we will go to after death. But the hereafter is also everything that comes after this very moment of mine. I am talking about a worldly word. A worldly word, in a sense, this is the secular or cultural interpretation of the Holy Book. In other words, the book you call holy, the Holy Book, actually gains its sanctity by interpreting a world that is not holy. That is, the Holy Book derives its sanctity by sanctifying something that is not holy. It draws its power from there. For example, if a hungry person is not fed, the name of God as the provider does not manifest. Therefore, the name provider manifests itself by feeding a person, by touching the world. That's why the metaphysical is indebted to the physical world. This is where the emphasis lies in the dualistic system I'm talking about.
You usually define concepts through their opposites anyway. In other words, if there is an affirmation, you define it through its negative, through an opposite word, and in this way it becomes much better understood. You also suggest reading the Quran in the same way, with a dual reference, physical and metaphysical here and there. So we've seen the past and the future through these perspectives. We're also talking about today, but in modern times, staying in the moment, living in the present is something that is described much more affirmatively, much more positively, and is recommended. It's said and suggested that a person should always stay in the moment, live for the day, carpe diem, and that this is much more important. How do you view this in the context of the Quran? So what do you say to the perspectives that view the Quran as just a story of the past and that it doesn't really mean much for today or the future?
You know that carpe diem, living in the moment, has a second part as well, memento mori. That is, remember death as well. Now, I definitely support what you said, that phrase. In other words, let's live in the moment. There's no debate about that. All the narratives about the past are actually about living in the present. I mean, why does it tell me the story of Moses? If you ask me who would understand Moses best, if you ask me, it's a murderer serving time in prison for killing someone. In other words, the kind of conscience movement that taking a life causes, what Dostoevsky made his character Raskolnikov experience, that pang of conscience, the remorse he felt after killing those sisters, reveals the inner reckoning and accounting of a murderer within his own world. Now, the process a murderer goes through after committing the act is his story, his past. But look at the moment itself, a past that affects a single moment. The Quran tells his story, the Prophet's story, or rather, the Quran tells the story of Moses to the Prophet. Why? Because he will experience similar events himself, and having knowledge of the story of an event before actually living through it is, in terms of precaution, something that develops the category of patience when you encounter it, allowing you to see it as a test and showing that there will always be a way out. We benefit greatly from this in Jung's work, Gustav Jung, as both a psychiatrist and a psychologist. He says the following. Jung says this: I have learned a lot from evils, he says. Now look, the sentence, I have learned a lot from evils, in quotation marks, refers to a kind of pool of knowledge that helps you take precautions and stay alert so that the evils others have experienced do not happen to you. The Quran does not recount the entirety of humanity's accumulated experience. It's not a history book. It doesn't have any concern with chronology like that. It tells you about the likely high probability events that could occur in anyone's life. Otherwise, there have been such events in history that the human mind cannot even imagine. That is, most of what is described in Greek tragedies never actually happened and never will. For example, the wars between gods, or one god abducting another god's daughter, and so on. Then there are the curses.
But there is a message, a lesson we need to take from them.
Greek tragedies are tragedies, but when it comes to human life, they are tragedies that are very unlikely to enter into real human experience. The stories told in the Quran, on the other hand, are events that are highly likely to occur in each of our lives. In other words, Moses can manifest in any one of us. Why? Well, Moses killed a man. I could kill someone too. It kills, after all. And as for the Prophet Joseph, the things he went through, like the incidents of theft, what happened to his brother Benjamin, these are all things that could happen in Egypt or elsewhere. So the telling of all these stories, what I'm saying is, why does the Quran tell so many stories, so many narratives? All of these are told to shed light on the life of the person living in the present moment, what we call carpe diem. Therefore, things like hope for the future, the lifting of the sorrow of the past, and so on. This dual system that I mentioned is called immanent metaphysics today, immanent metaphysics. In other words, all the foundational structural terms we use in metaphysics, justice, freedom, fairness, equality, contain structure. All of these words are metaphysical terms. They are all metaphysical. We did not create these. These are words that already exist. However, if you talk about these independently of your own world, these metaphysical words just float in the air. For example, evil, metaphysical evil. Evil is a metaphysical concept. But when you bring the word evil down into your own world, it becomes injustice. It becomes oppression, and the perpetrator is right there. You see them. So we encounter a bad event and start to interpret it. What happened here? Well, actually, this evil exists in the history of humanity. No, you started the sentence wrong. Isn't this evil? The moment you call it evil, you're covering up the real issue. Because clearly, where this is heading is to the question of why God allowed or created evil. And in doing so, you lose sight of the real perpetrator. However, the conceptual framework you should be discussing here is this. The perpetrators of this injustice, this corruption, this oppression. Look, we are in the world. This is immanent metaphysics. I have transferred the word evil from metaphysics to the earth under the name of oppression. And its perpetrator is clear, its punishment is clear. I am the one who sets and determines that as humanity. Therefore, when we talk about the Holy Book constructs a secular world, the sacred world. There is no such world. But it gains its sacredness when it constructs the world here. Otherwise, that sacredness is just a sacredness floating in the air. What we need to ask is, to what extent have these books, the holy books, truly been effective in our world with their conceptual map? Don't people question the world we live in? So many prophets, so many holy books, so many moral theories, so many moral philosophers. And the result? In the end, during the time of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Dijon Academy held a competition. The question was this: humanity has produced so much science, so much culture and art. Has this been for the benefit of humanity or to its detriment? Now, Jean-Jacques Rousseau responds to this. He says it was not for the benefit of humanity. On the contrary, it brought evil. He says it chained our hands and feet, but covered those chains with flowers. So why is a philosopher, a thinker, complaining? So much scientific progress. We realize that we are very skilled at accumulating knowledge, but we couldn't add wisdom alongside this knowledge. We produced a lot of knowledge, but we missed the point of where this knowledge would take us. In other words, we overlooked thought. So every individual has the right to ask this question. In a world where so many holy books have been revealed, why is there so much injustice? Why is there so much corruption? Why are so many people living below the poverty line? We understand that we have no shortcomings when it comes to knowledge. In fact, we have an excess. So whether the Quran gave me the knowledge of the past or not, it doesn't really concern me much. Why is it giving us so much knowledge? What you're saying doesn't have any meaning. What difference does it make if it gives little knowledge? What difference does it make if it gives a lot of knowledge? The real issue is whether it prompts you to take action or not. The Quran is not a source of information, but of performance. In other words, it tries to guide you toward action. Otherwise, it would just give you a to-do list. Go and do these things. Why does it spend 600 pages talking to you like this? Why does it present so much argumentation? The whole point is to create a person who, in this very moment, has an active emotional world, wants to communicate with others, has developed empathy, and can truly connect with others. To build the moment, to construct the present.
Unfortunately, we tend to see religion as just a to-do list, as you said, a sequence of rituals, and think that's all there is to it. I mean, just performing the rituals and doing what's required.
Even that is a discipline for building the present moment. In other words, even rituals are a discipline to create an active, dynamic individual in the moment. Worship is good, one should do it.
But it's not limited to that. It's not just that.
When you consider it to be only that, I call this a historicity. Not misfortune, but a historicity. In other words, you are then forced to spin your wheels outside of history.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Professor, for your valuable insights. Once again, you have provided us with very valuable information, especially regarding reading the Quran with its dual reference system. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dear viewers, today we talked about reading the Quran with its dual reference system. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.